All right, let's get right into it. We all think of 1776 as the year America was born, right? But the 12 months before that famous July were just a total whirlwind. We're talking desperate gambles, absolutely crushing defeats, and a few honest-to-goodness miracles. This was the year the American Revolution could have completely flamed out before it even really began.
Kind of surprising, isn't it? Before they'd even declared themselves a country, the Patriots' first big military move wasn't playing defense. Nope. It was a bold, ambitious, and frankly, incredibly risky plan to go on the offense and try to conquer Canada.
On paper, the logic actually seemed pretty sound. The Continental Congress figured the French Canadians, who had only been under British rule for a little while, would be eager to join the rebellion. With only about 800 British soldiers stationed there, it looked like a quick win that would add a 14th colony to the cause and get rid of a huge threat from the north. What could go wrong?
Well, as you can see here, the plan started to unravel almost immediately. General Montgomery did manage to take Montreal, but his army was just crumbling from desertion and sickness. At the same time, Colonel Benedict Arnold was leading another army on one of the most brutal marches in military history, right through the freezing Maine wilderness. He said the journey had 1,000 difficulties I never expected. By the time the two forces finally met up outside Quebec, they were just a shadow of what they'd started with, down to only 1,200 men. They were out of time. Their soldiers' enlistments were about to expire, so they had to attack, ready or not. So on the very last day of the year, in a blinding snowstorm, they assaulted the city. It was a complete disaster. The British were waiting for them. General Montgomery was killed almost instantly. Arnold was badly wounded, hundreds were captured, and the few who got away were left starving, freezing, and riddled with smallpox, hundreds of miles from home. The first big American offensive of the war was an absolute catastrophe. But while this complete disaster was unfolding up north, a totally different and maybe even more audacious plan was starting to take shape hundreds of miles away at the siege of Boston. See, the Continental Army had the British trapped in the city, but they had no way to actually force them out. They needed big guns, and they needed a miracle.
And that miracle showed up in the form of 59 captured cannons. These were the very guns that had been taken from the British at Fort Ticonderoga in a surprise raid. They were big, they were heavy, and they were exactly what George Washington needed to break the stalemate. There was just one small problem.
The cannons were 300 miles away. And we're not talking a nice paved highway here. Those 300 miles were covered in the snow, ice, and frozen mountains of a New England winter. Trying to move thousands and thousands of pounds of iron across frozen lakes and over mountain ranges, it just seemed completely and totally impossible.
And this is where the hero of our story comes in, Henry Knox. Now, this guy wasn't some seasoned general. He was a 25-year-old bookseller from Boston who had just read a ton of books on military engineering. He went to Washington and promised him he could deliver the cannons. And then he pulled it off, masterminding this brilliant operation using sleds, oxen, and just sheer willpower to drag what he called his noble train of artillery all the way to Boston.
So, with the cannons finally in place, Washington cooks up this absolutely brilliant piece of deception. He knows a direct attack is way too risky. So, for 2 nights, he orders a loud, pointless bombardment of the city just to distract the British. Then, on the 3rd night, under the cover of all that noise, his men worked like crazy, hauling 20 of Knox's cannons and pre-built fortifications up onto Dorchester Heights, a spot that overlooked the entire city and, more importantly, the entire British fleet.
When the sun came up the next morning, the British were absolutely stunned. It's like a fortress had just appeared overnight on the hills above them, making their warships in the harbor total sitting ducks. The British commander, General Howe, knew he'd been completely outmaneuvered. He tried to organize an attack, but a storm hit and stopped him. His position was hopeless. He had no choice but to pack up and leave. In March 1776, the entire British army sailed away, handing the Patriots their first real, major victory of the war.
Now, the victory in Boston was a massive morale boost for sure, but it couldn't hide a really dangerous truth. This wasn't just a war against a king thousands of miles away. It was rapidly turning into an American civil war. Society was deeply and violently divided. This chart really puts it all in perspective. While, yeah, almost half the population supported the Patriot cause, a huge chunk, about 1 in every 5 Americans, stayed loyal to King George III. They were called loyalists. And then another third of the population was just trying to stay out of it completely. This was not a unified rebellion. It was a messy, bitter family fight.
So, what made you pick a side? Well, the Patriots were really driven by these big ideas of liberty and self-government, protesting what they saw as British tyranny. Loyalists, though, had all sorts of complex reasons. Some had strong business ties to Britain, some were new immigrants, and a lot of them just truly believed that loyalty to the king was the only thing preventing society from collapsing into total chaos and mob rule. This quote from a loyalist just perfectly captures their biggest fear. They looked at the Patriot committees and all the angry mobs, and they didn't see the birth of liberty. They saw the rise of anarchy. To them, the king, even a flawed one, was a much better option than being ruled by their own potentially violent neighbors. You can imagine how this tore communities and even families apart.
So, in the middle of all this turmoil, you've got military disaster in the north, a huge victory in the south, and a civil war brewing everywhere. The political ground was shifting. The idea of not just resisting Britain, but of breaking away for good was gaining this unstoppable momentum.
And a huge reason for that shift was a simple little pamphlet called Common Sense. Thomas Paine wrote it, and it wasn't for lawyers or intellectuals. It was written for everyday people. In plain, powerful language, it just completely shredded the whole idea of a monarchy and made this incredibly passionate case for an independent American republic. It went viral, 18th century style, selling a staggering number of copies and convincing thousands that independence was the only path forward. Pushed along by public opinion and the events of the war, the Continental Congress finally took that last irreversible step. After a lot of heated debate, on July 4th, 1776, they formally adopted a document declaring that the 13 colonies were now and would be forever free and independent states. These words, they were the heart of the new nation. They laid out this radical vision of a country founded not on bloodlines or ancient history, but on a shared belief in universal human rights. By signing their names to this, the delegates were literally pledging their lives and their fortunes to this cause. It was just this incredible moment of triumph and idealism. But while patriots were out in the streets tearing down statues of King George and celebrating, the British Empire was preparing its answer. The rebellion wasn't going to be treated like some minor disturbance anymore. Oh no, this was now all-out war. Because declaring independence is one thing. Actually winning it is something else entirely. For over a year, the Patriots had kind of had things their way, but that was all about to change. King George III was done playing games. He told his government, "When these rebels feel a sharp blow, they will submit." Washington correctly guessed that the next British target would be New York, so he moved his army to defend it. As you can see on this chart, he managed to scrape together about 20,000 soldiers. But just look at what was coming for him. A massive, professional army of 32,000 British regulars and German mercenaries. And they didn't just walk there. They arrived on a massive fleet of 400 ships. One American on the shore described the sight, saying, "I wish I may never feel such feelings again." Can you even imagine that? This was the largest expeditionary force in British history up to that point.
Let that sink in. The full, awesome power of the 18th century's greatest superpower was now descending on the brand new United States. Britain was focusing nearly half of its entire military strength on one single goal: to find Washington's army, crush it, and end this rebellion once and for all. So this leaves us with the ultimate question. The Americans had made their grand gamble. They had declared their ideals to the entire world. But as they stood on the shores of New York, watching that forest of ship masts grow on the horizon, they had to face the terrifying reality of their choice. They had declared their freedom. But now, could they possibly survive it?